From the war on Disney to the calamitous presidential campaign launch on Twitter, or X, or whatever you want to call it, Ron DeSantis is no stranger to the news, but what do we really know about him? In this episode, we take a closer look at Trump's early challenger for the Republican nomination. Where does he come from? What does he stand for? And what does his meteoric rise through the GOP tell us about politics in America? As we answer the question, who is Ron DeSantis? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Returning from the faculty is Dr. Emma Long, Associate Professor of American History and Politics and Head of the Department of American Studies at the University of East Anglia. Welcome back, Emma.
Hi, Liam. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. And one day I'm going to completely stumble over that title. But so far,
yeah, it's not exactly, doesn't trip off the tongue very easily, does it? Sorry about that.
That's fine. It's good to have you on. So let's just jump straight into this, because as I think anyone listening to the podcast will be aware of, Ron DeSantis has announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination for the 2024 presidential election. He launched on Twitter rather disastrously through a live space with Elon Musk. Despite that, I really don't think we still know who this guy is. So we're going to look at, firstly, who Ron DeSantis is, but also what his very rapid rise up the ranks tells us about politics, about presidential elections. And we're just going to have a good natter about the policies that we can expect from DeSantis as well. So let's look at his background. Emma, what do we know about him?
Okay, so he's a native Floridian, born and brought up in Florida. He's got a fairly uneventful, should we say, in a weird way, sort of history and kind of his early life, quite traditional actually for American politicians. So he went to Yale Law School, studied history. So go history. Obviously, some degree of fan of that, although as we might come on to talk about, he's a fan of certain types of history, should we say, not all of it. He went to Harvard Law School. He joined the military, so he's a veteran, which is not actually an unusual background for people who have and do serve in Congress. His legal background meant that he was in the Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps, or the JAG Corps, if anybody knows of that. And if they're the same age as me, they might remember an old American TV series called JAG, which is where we got to know about what it was. But as part of that, he worked with Guantanamo detainees, the American military base at Guantanamo Bay, those who were held there under the War on Terror. He was also based for a while during the 2007 troop insurgency in Iraq. He was based in Fallujah. So he has that sort of military experience. In some ways, he's come to political prominence quite quickly. There are some parallels, not direct, but some similar parallels to Barack Obama, who, Obama really wasn't very well known and not really sort of well known in national politics before he gave a very famous speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention just before he was elected to the Senate, and it launched him into the stratosphere politically. And of course, what happened then is he used that very successfully, and then his new career in the Senate as a launch pad to the 2008 presidential campaign. DeSantis has sort of taken a slightly different route, but he seems to have emerged almost as quickly in that sense. So he was elected to Congress from Florida's 6th district I think he was elected in 2012, but took office in 2013. It's a safe conservative seat. It has voted for every Republican president by roughly a 60-40 split in every election in the 21st century, just to give you an idea of what that seat looks like. So it was pretty safe for someone of his politics. He represented the House, Florida in the House, until 2018, when he ran for Florida governor, which is where he is now. It was quite a story in 2018 when he ran for governor. He won the election by 0.4% of the vote, which even in American terms is a really tiny margin. It went to recounts, and there's a whole thing around
Even in
that.
Florida terms, that's small margins, right?
Even in Florida terms, we're talking
Yeah.
small margins. We're talking a few hundred votes here or there across the entirety of the state. But he's been very popular, and that might be something we want to think about, why he's been popular, the politics of Florida, which, like all of the states, have its own kind of internal politics as much as anything else. But I think what really has launched him into a kind of national level consciousness is he re-won the governor's seat in 2022, so back last year, with a 19.4% majority. So he's gone from a 0.4% majority to 19.4% over his nearest rival. And it was a combination of that and the fact that he won a number of traditionally Democratic counties, getting re-elected. He also won a large proportion of the Hispanic vote, which traditionally the Hispanic vote has tended to be seen to be more Democratic leaning, particularly issues of around issues of immigration. But Florida has a particularly big Cuban population, which tend to lean more politically conservative. So one of the things about that election is it flagged up the variety within what's often labeled the Hispanic vote. But yeah, the combination of the big percentage win, the massive increase in the majority over 2018, and the shift of some of those key districts that had voted sort of for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election, sort of all combined to mean that the media attention was suddenly on him. Trump was sort of on the down and out a little bit after the 2020 election. He'd been absent for a little while. So I think inevitably media coverage shifts to this young, sort of photogenic, well-spoken, articulate Republican candidate who just had so much success in the election. So, and he's obviously then parlayed that into a run for the presidency and a challenge to Trump in 2024. So, he's got quite a traditional political background in some ways for American politicians, and he'd been in politics certainly longer than Obama. But he seems to have come to national consciousness quite recently, and quite quickly. So that seems to be why there's a lot of focus on him.
Yeah, and you said that there's a lot of parallels between DeSantis and Obama. I mean, those parallels probably come to an end when we start looking at his policies, but certainly in terms of background. And I think on paper, DeSantis is textbook presidential candidate. He's got a law background, he's got a military background to some degree. He's got, I say he's got the looks. He's as you say, there's a photogenicness about him that tends to serve candidates very well. He knows how to present himself on a camera and behind a podium, and that's, as you say, contributed a lot. I wonder, and we can probably talk about Obama here as well, but I wonder if 10 years, because he's roughly been in politics 10 years, hasn't he, or so, that doesn't feel like a long time to really establish yourself in the political system enough to be at the very top.
No, but then, you think about Trump, who'd had no political background experience before running in 2016. And, one of the reasons that a lot of people voted for him in 2016 was that sense that government wasn't working, right? The establishment wasn't working for them. Government wasn't working. What it needed was someone to come in and shake everything up. Now, what we know happened after 2016 is that some of those sort of, if you like, the more central moderate voters who voted for Trump found that the extent to which Trump shook everything up, was perhaps a little too much for them, and some of them moved away from him in the 2022 election.
Mm,
But that narrative of running from outside Washington, of having some government experience but bringing something else to the table, that's not new. Jimmy Carter did that in 1976, right?
yeah.
While America was still trying to overcome the impact of the Watergate scandal and Nixon, he's very much about he'd been governor of Georgia, so he came in with that sort of outsider or outside Washington elite type language. Bill Clinton sort of did a similar thing in 1992. He'd been in politics a while, but he'd been governor of Arkansas. So again, outside to some extent of Washington politics.
Mm,
Obama had only been elected a few years before. I mean, this was a discussion that we were having about Obama around 2008. Was he'd been involved in very local politics, but did a few years in the Senate really give him the political background to be able to sort of run the country. Now, critics of Obama, of course, would say it didn't, and his 8 years as president proved it.
if depending on who you ask, they'd say he wasn't even American, but that's another can of worms, isn't there?
Well, there's a whole other podcast topic, I think. Obviously, I think for most people, whether grudgingly or not, would accept that he did everything from a good job to an okay job, right? As president, that those years of the lack of that political experience compared to some previous presidents didn't actually harm him. So in that sense, DeSantis's position isn't unusual among some of the more recent candidates. You could expect that if it got to the general election part of this, and he was the main candidate, and that's a big if given some of the other candidates that are putting themselves forward for the Republican nomination. But if he got to that point, you can imagine that would be part of the debate that would be had, but he'd have comebacks for that.
And another thing that DeSantis has in his favor is that I feel like Trump and Biden are going to cancel each other out with the age argument, because that was Trump's whole thing 4 years ago, and obviously he'll come back with that again, next year. But Trump himself is now as old as Biden was when he won that first term, so that argument doesn't really stand up. DeSantis, on the other hand, is at the moment 44. He's sort of mid-40s.
I think so, yeah.
If he won the nomination, he'd be the youngest presidential candidate since Obama, probably 12 years ago.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's certainly one of the younger candidates. I mean, he's quite advanced if you compare him to the youngest presidential candidate in American history was William Jennings Bryan back in 1896, who was 36 when he unsuccessfully ran for the presidency the first time. It's hard to imagine. We think of William Jennings Bryan as a much older man, but he ran for the presidency. And think about someone like Pete Buttigieg, who didn't win the nomination in the 2000 election, but was one of the Democratic frontrunners and is now in the Biden administration. He was 37, running for the candidacy. But I mean, you think about the youngest person to be elected president in American history, which was John Kennedy. He was, I think, 43, when he was elected. So DeSantis isn't far off that. And I think we talked a while back in the podcast about the presidency when we talked with John Sopel about, is this the best the Republicans and the Democrats can put forward? These two old white men. And we said then, well, no, it really isn't, or at least it shouldn't be. So DeSantis is someone who's younger, who sort of media savvy, in a different way from Trump, who's tried very hard to kind of win over the media, who has a young family and those kinds of things. It's a very different image from the ones that you're going to get from Trump and Biden, and one that I suspect his team is thinking is closer to most American voters' experience.
Yeah.
The idea if he's younger, he's more in touch with what it's like to be sort of an ordinary American, if there is any such thing. And he's also, I mean, one of the other things that might be worth mentioning here, looking into sort of some of his background, compared to some American politicians, he's not hugely wealthy. So, we talk a lot about the influence of money in politics, and sometimes that's individuals' money, like Trump. We know Trump spent a lot of his own money in the 2016 and 2020 campaigns, which legally he's able to do. But quite often, those who run for office in the United States are independently wealthy, or have become so through whatever their careers were before that. Relatively speaking, and we are talking relatively, DeSantis's assets are not as huge as some American politicians. So that idea that he's maybe more able to understand what it's like for people living on minimum wage, right? Trying to make do or make ends meet in an economy with high inflation and difficult healthcare costs and those kinds of things. I suspect his campaign is thinking that they can use that in this kind of context to say he's more in touch.
This is where I think we need to start picking apart DeSantis as a politician, because I think you're right. I think all of these things that you've just said, the not being part of the 1%, the being younger, and he'll say that makes him more competent, being more connected to the people. These are all just their campaign slogans, aren't they? They're ways to get votes. But then you start to look at who Ron DeSantis actually is as a politician, what he's doing, and his policies. And this is where it gets a bit murkier, because he would want us to believe, certainly if he wins the nomination and goes to a national general election, he will want the electorate to believe that he's more central than Trump, that he's more representative of both sides of the fence. That's not really the case, though, is it?
No, not really. I mean, we're talking about things that I think we've touched on, previous episodes have also touched on, which is this difference in elections between sort of the image you craft and the message that you want to send out. But ultimately, you've also got to have some policies somewhere along the line, right? You've got to say what you stand for or what you stand against. And I think we've also mentioned before that you can't get elected to the presidency without winning over some of those middle voters. You can appeal to your base. That's important in the primary season, right? The first stage of the election when you're trying to get the party nomination. But when you switch from that bit to the general election, sort of usually from the September to the November part of that process, when you've got to appeal to the entire electorate, you can't win the presidency without winning some of those moderate voters. And that, I think, I mean, without wishing to pretend I'm predicting anything for well over an election that's well over a year into the future at this point, that's where DeSantis is going to have trouble, I think, with moderate voters, because when you look at his record, he is not in the middle of the Republican Party. I mean, even if you assume that the Republican Party has moved to the right of American politics in recent years, which it unquestionably has, DeSantis is not really in the middle. And he's certainly not in the middle of broadly American politics. I mean, he was one of the founder members of the Freedom Caucus, which is a group within the Republican members of Congress. Founded in 2015, which is widely considered to be the most right wing of all of the groups within the Republican Party. And they were formed quite specifically as a way to push the Republican Party to the right. He's a founder member. You don't volunteer for membership for that, you get invited. So you have to be part of that in group to be part of that. So you've got that as a starting point. If you look at his congressional record, the years he was representing Florida in Congress, there's no doubt that he fits in with the Republican political sphere, right? So he opposed tax hikes for policies about global warming. He voted to repeal Obamacare and
standard stuff.
He opposed Obama's policies on immigration, and DACA, which is the policy that allowed for paths to citizenship for for people who'd been brought into the United States as children. Right. So he opposed that. So yeah, all of those things are fairly familiar from the Republican side of the aisle, if you like, in the period that he was there. But then when you start looking at some of the things that he's done and is doing as governor of Florida in the last few years, and particularly the things that have been hitting the headlines of late, you begin to see some of those things that would, I think, cause him some difficulties with moderate voters across the United States. So to be honest, I don't even know where to start with some of these. But so if I just give you some examples, right, and then maybe we can come back and unpick some of them. But he has, there's, along with, is it Greg Abbott, who's the governor of Texas, there's been this thing to protest what they see as the weak federal government stance on illegal immigration by taking people who have claimed asylum at the border and shipping them to democratic states. Right? It's just sending them to democratic states and say, there you go, you look after them, completely ignoring that these are people who often don't know what is happening or where they're being moved to. But that's hit the headlines
arguably
recently.
Better than Rwanda, though, right?
I would think, yes, definitely better than Rwanda. But that same policy, right, of moving people on.
Yeah.
He sort of became quite well known during the COVID pandemic. Florida was one of the first to start lifting restrictions. He did implement stay-at-home restrictions initially, but he was one of the governors who began to lift those quite quickly. He opposed the mask mandate to require federal government employees to wear masks. He wasn't alone in that, but it's sort of put him on the map. He's attacked education in a number of different ways, which links into my point earlier about history, right? He's got this slogan which says Florida is where woke goes to die, and it's part of this broader sort of conservative critique about the teaching of civil rights history, of issues about racial equality, and particularly racial inequality in America's history, and how that is taught to school children. Right, so there has been legislation in Florida about that sort of restricts the way in which teachers are able to teach those subjects. There's also the famous law, which it's called, I think, the Florida Parental Rights in Education Act, which is better known as the Don't Say Gay law. Which effectively says that you can't talk about issues to do with homosexuality or same-sex marriage or those kinds of things at high school level. So it's that idea of we're challenging this left-wing woke agenda, and we're not going to allow the corruption of our kids in schools, and all wrapped up in the language of parental control, which is very much a narrative that is coming from the further right of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
So those are playing to like the Trump base, right? The further right of the party, not moderates. He signed an abortion law which bans abortion outside of after 6 weeks. So again, not unusual for Republican states, but very much up there in terms of sort of leading the charge against abortion.
Yeah, that's still drastic. Like, you expect any Republican-run state to be generally anti-abortion, but a 6-week cutoff, that's sending a real message politically as well.
Yeah, most people don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's partly why a lot of states have gone for that, because they can say, well, we're not banning it completely, when in practice, actually, the reality is that it puts fairly severe limitations on it. It's becoming more common among Republican states, but yeah, it's a very, very strict law. On the other end of the spectrum, he's also a gun rights supporter. So there's a law that's, I think, just about to come into effect in Florida as we record this in the summer of 2023, that means that if you want to carry a concealed weapon in public, you don't need a permit to do that. So he's very much on the kind of the rights of gun owners. He's challenging the Supreme Court by reinstituting the death penalty for certain classifications of crime that the Supreme Court has said the death penalty should not be eligible for. So he's trying to set up a legal case, probably like the one that saw the overturning of Roe versus Wade last year. So all of those things, like the culture wars issues, to use a term that I have some problems with, but is familiar to people, right? Those
Yeah.
issues about race, sexual identity, gender, about guns, about abortion, about religion, all of those issues, right? When you look at where he stands on those kinds of issues, he is very much looking seemingly to appeal to the kind of the Trump populist right wing base. And we know from opinion polls that if you look at moderate voters, those ones he's going to win over to need to win the presidential election, those are issues where the far right of the Republican Party are out of kilter. So, I mean, that's not to say that candidates haven't been able to do that in the past. You appeal to your base in the primary season, and then you pivot back to the middle for the general election. But it's a harder one to do, especially now with social media and on some of these kinds of issues where people feel really strongly. The risk is you alienate the moderate voters in the primaries and then you can't get them back, or if you can get them back, you might alienate your base who feel like you're selling out and compromising with the other side.
Yeah.
So economically, he's sort of very much in what we would think of as the mainstream conservative area, sort of low, support for business, low taxes, those kinds of things. But he's really seems to be staking out since he declared his presidency, or his run for the presidency, sorry. He really seems to be staking out on these bigger social issues, a position that seems to be trying in a weird way to out-Trump Trump. And actually, a lot of commentators have suggested that's where he's struggling, because actually it's very difficult to do that given how much oxygen Trump tends to soak up. But yeah, he's very, very clearly sort of setting himself out on that path, as are some of the other Republican candidates. So the broad, if you like, looking beyond DeSantis, the broad story of the Republican side of this early part of the presidential race is what Republican Party emerges. Which version of the Republican Party becomes the one that the party puts forward into the general election? Is it somebody from the slightly more moderate side of the party who can try to reach across the aisle?
Yeah.
Or is it someone, is it Trump? Is it someone who's trying to put themselves slightly to the right of Trump? DeSantis is one in what is likely to become an even more crowded field. So that's, if you like, that's part of the story of this early stage of the election.
Yeah, and there's definitely the key question here. I think for any Republican candidate is how do you position yourself relative to Trump, because he is the one to beat, and that he just all the polls indicate that he currently is way ahead. So it's how do you stand out against Trump as well as against the rest of the field. There's been a very interesting way that DeSantis has chosen to do this, not least through everything you've said, but through one of the targets of his campaign against the culture wars and against woke, and that's Disney. And now that's a big target to try and take down, and he's really going all in on it, isn't he? Like it is DeSantis versus Disney in Florida.
Yeah, which is an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, I mean it came about with the Parental Rights in Education Act that I just mentioned. So Florida passed the Don't Say Gay law. Disney is a huge corporation which employs a large number of Americans across the US, and there is a very large LGBTQ constituency within Disney, both as fans and employment. And what happened was a large number of Disney employees protested the fact that Disney was not taking a stand on that law in Florida, because obviously they've got a big theme park there and associated theme parks. So they're a big employer in the region. They bring a lot of money in. And the original head, I think, of Disney wanted to sort of stay out of it, and then there was a sort of a response from employees who said this is unacceptable. This is an attack on the LGBTQ community. We need to stand up for that. Ultimately, Disney did, and of course, what DeSantis has kind of labeled them, right? For DeSantis and his supporters, and some who perhaps are less supportive of DeSantis, but of the bigger issue, are now seeing Disney as like the epitome of woke culture. I don't know what that word really means in the way that it gets used, but they are using it as a symbol, right, of a fight against the things in the changing American culture around issues of sexuality, of gender identity, of how we talk about difficult issues to our children, right? Those aren't easy questions to have about how you introduce these complex topics to young people and as they get older, so that they understand what's going on around them. But conservatives have kind of taken a particular line on these issues, and they're sort of painting Disney as the big symbol of all the things that they think are wrong with this changing culture. And yeah, I mean, DeSantis is not backing down. He tried to so since it was formed, Disney has been like a county in its own right, which has given it the political power and the legal power to sort of control the area in which the theme parks exist. DeSantis has tried to take that over, basically to say, no, you don't get to control what happens on your own land anymore. There is a court case pending about that, so we don't quite know where that's going to go. So you've got that element of it. You've got the media relations side of it. You've got Disney earlier on this year saying that they were going to build a big office block or something along those lines, about an investment of about, I think, estimated about $1 billion that they've decided they're not going to go ahead with. They say that it's partly a response to what DeSantis has been doing in Florida. DeSantis and others have been saying, well, no, this was already planned in advance, and he said, she said, they said, going on there. But yeah, I mean, DeSantis is playing a high stakes game here, if you like. It's a very high profile, very powerful, very wealthy organization whose products are loved by a lot of Americans across the political spectrum. So if he takes them on and wins, then that has consequences in a wide variety of fields. But I guess he's banking on the fact that if he can, that gives him a boost politically. If he takes them on and partially wins, then he benefits from that, or if he can spin it into a way that says he's won. If he takes them on and loses, then that's pretty much the end of that. That will damage his career significantly. So it's an interesting choice by him to try to take on something that is so very high profile, and a company that has the resources to fight back.
But I think what I find most interesting about this is that this fight was started by DeSantis. It wasn't that he was jumping on the bandwagon that the Republicans were already set off with. So he's not only started that fight with Disney, he's now setting the agenda for the National Republican Party, because they're backing him. They're very much behind DeSantis, and I guess that leads me on to thinking about DeSantis as an influencer within his party and his ability to lead the party and win the presidency, because he obviously has a lot of gravitas in the GOP. How? I guess is my question, because he hasn't really been in politics that long. He has kind of piggybacked on sort of the Trumpian wing of the party. So how is he polling so high above every other candidate besides Trump.
Well, I was going to say relatively. I mean,
Yeah.
he's a long way behind Trump, although
Yeah.
he's certainly ahead of other candidates in the field. But we're also a long way out from the election, so that's not hugely unusual. And of course, what's happened is that from the height of his re-election in 2022, when everybody was sort of like, oh, he's the next presidential candidate, his poll numbers have dropped significantly, and I think even his team would acknowledge that. So there's an interesting story there about the way in which the media, I think, tells stories about who is and isn't political or potential political candidates such a long way out from the election, and how quickly that attention can shift, and how that can play a role in whether people are successful. Yes, he's leading on Disney, with Disney specifically, but the issues around it are not specific to him. They've been around for quite a long time. So in that sense, he's drawing on concerns that are already there within the Republican base on these issues, and just targeting something that is very high profile within his state. So
he's just given it a face and a brand name for everyone to point the finger at, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. There's an element of that. So he's not shaping, if you like, the internal discussions. He's directing them in a particular way. But that's not to say that he doesn't perhaps have some influence behind the scenes, or at least as a voice in that. Like I said, as part of the Freedom Caucus, you have to be invited to that. So he's obviously seen within those circles as someone whose voice they want as part of that, who's somebody who's with them, who may have a role. So there's that side of that, and his influence within those circles. The Republican Party, again, I think we've touched on this in previous podcasts, but the Republican Party has become more conservative in recent years, and groups like the Freedom Caucus and Trump and DeSantis and some of the others are both symptomatic of that shift, and have helped push that shift a little bit. So they're both sides of that. So he's not on the margins from that point of view. Does that translate into a bigger influence within the Republican Party? That I think we have to wait and see. I think we have to see as we get closer to the election. Like I said, in terms of polling numbers, he's pretty low at the moment.
Well, he has slipped, isn't he? He's lost some ground.
Yes. Yeah, and one of the criticisms or suggestions for that is, again, any Republican candidate is going to have to deal with Trump, right? You can't go round it, you can't ignore it. You're going to have to deal with Trump, since he's announced that he intends to run. So Republican candidates have a couple of options, right? One is to just outright criticize Trump, to separate themselves off and say, that is not my Republican Party, that is not what I stand for. Whether they choose to stand to the center of the party or place themselves further on the right, they can do that. But that's dangerous, because Trump is so popular. And we've seen in previous elections, Trump is really good at sort of stereotyping or creating characters for opponents with phrases and things like that, which can damage their campaigns. We saw it very effectively in 2016. So
and of course, the only candidate that's been brave enough to actually speak out against Trump so far is Mike Pence. Who was, of course, his vice president. Yeah. And then, of course, in the wider party, as far as I'm aware, the only high-profile Republican who is very outspoken against Trump is former presidential candidate Mitt Romney.
Yeah, who of course is definitely not running again. So, that's not surprising in some ways, given how popular Trump appears to be, or at least the assumption of how popular he is with voters. Standing up against him has not proved to be politically very successful for a lot of people. So you can see why people might be wary of doing that. It's a bold decision to do that. But the difficulty of the other way is, how do you differentiate yourself from Trump without alienating his voters? And that seems to be sort of what DeSantis and some of the others are trying to do at the moment. But that's, so I think some of the culture wars issues, he's trying to say, I'm taking a stronger stance on some of these issues about LGBTQ issues. I'm taking a stronger stance on abortion. I'm taking a stronger stance on the death penalty and on guns than Trump did, without trying to directly criticize him. But that's a surprisingly nuanced argument to make in the nature of American politics, which often requires a sledgehammer to get messages across. And at the moment, at least, the polls suggest that that message from DeSantis is not really getting through with voters. But again, we are a long way out from the election, and those things can change.
Yeah, and I wonder, because it seems like he's gearing up for a sort of two-pronged approach. The first to win the nomination being, targeting Republican voters with his track record, which very much appeals to the Republican base and also to Trump voters. But he's being very cautious about promoting that wider, because obviously when it comes to, if he wins the nomination and goes to a full national election, he doesn't really want left-leaning voters or anyone on the fence to know that he's really been that far right. And so he's playing this kind of, I'm younger, I'm for the people, I'm a better vote than sort of Biden, basically. That's a very difficult sort of approach to sort of keep up, because people are becoming more aware of DeSantis, and that's reflecting in the polls. Like, he is slipping, and I think people are just starting maybe to see through the cracks of this sort of very suave political face.
Yeah, very possibly. I mean, it's always going to happen, right? You can't go, if you want to win the presidency, you can't go under the radar, right? You're not going to win it that way. So at a certain point, you're going to have to, appeal beyond your base and raise your profile. And there's some interesting things if you look on the DeSantis for President website, which I think we're going to put a link up for people to have a look at. If you look at the language of the things, like the way he describes what his background is and his policies, these are sort of coded in a way and written in such a way that in the nature of the current debate, it's quite clear where he stands on these. So to just to give you a few examples, holding woke corporations and school unions accountable. So we've got the woke in there, right? So that's linking into those issues that we were talking about earlier. He refers to saving livelihoods from job-killing lockdowns and vaccine mandates, which is obviously a dig at Biden and what was going on during the pandemic. He talks about Biden's border crisis, which of course there is a crisis at the America's southern border, but it's a crisis of decades in the making. The Biden White House may not be dealing with it very well, but they didn't necessarily create it. And here we go, this is one I particularly like. During the darkest days of 2020, when the corrupt establishment, bureaucracy, and corporate media united to force lockdowns and mandates on Americans, DeSantis stood up for freedom, even when it wasn't popular.
Well, wasn't it a Republican government in 2020 though?
Yes, initially, yes, under Trump. So there you go. But you've got those things in there, and this is on his website, right? To disseminate information about his campaign. There's a rolling thing which shows who's donated how much, and how quickly. It gives the impression of lots of people donating money. And there's a sort of summary of his biography and all kinds of other things on the website. But this is the bit where he's presenting himself and his policies and his stance, and that's available to anybody. So yeah, exactly. He can present himself as the young, mainstream, more energetic, more in touch with people Republican candidate, but people can go look at that, and they're going to see in the way these issues are worded, not necessarily just the stances, but the way that they are worded, where he falls into the current political spectrum. And you can't cover those things up, because you either stand for them or you don't.
Yeah. And so then looking at, how the electability of politicians to the presidency, obviously we're looking specifically at Ron DeSantis in this episode. So how would DeSantis get himself elected?
Oh, that's a good question. It's really hard to, at the moment, we've touched on this, it's really hard to see who manages to defeat Trump from within the Republican Party in the first instance. Now, we all know, it's been in the headlines, that Trump's got his own legal problems, right? And any one of those could potentially take him out of the race in some form, or at least restrict his ability to do that. We can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen with those. But DeSantis is going to have to find a better way to deal with Trump than he is at the moment. I think that's probably the key thing. If he wants to get elected, he's got to win the Republican primary first. And at the moment, as we speak, at least, he has not yet found a way to address the Trump problem. And if he can't do that, he's not going to get to the general election stage. If he can, and the general election stage, then it's a question of, is it Biden or is it somebody else running for the Democratic presidency? Then you do have, not exactly a complete replay of the 1960 election, but what you would then have is a younger candidate pointing at an older one. Richard Nixon in 1960 wasn't as old as Biden, obviously, but you've got that idea of somebody from outside of politics dealing with an establishment figure, a younger candidate versus an older one. You would expect that to be part of the debate as well as the politics of it. But all of that is such a long way off at the moment, and the DeSantis camp don't yet seem to have found a way to break those Trump supporters away. I think at the moment that's got to be the biggest question for them.
This episode of America, a History podcast, was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to our guest this week, Dr. Emma Long. And if you want to know more, just check out the resources that we've put in the show notes. And we put a lot of work into this show, so if you can leave us a nice rating or review wherever you're listening to the podcast, that would be great. Next time, I'm joined by Professor Tom Smith and Jonathan Hamilt from Drag Story Hour as we take a look at why children's literature is so divisive. But I still don't feel like a lot of people really know who this guy is. So that's what we're going to pick apart. And also within the context of how someone... Do you know what? I'm going to start that again because I don't know if you heard my dog just snore really, really loudly there. But
Perfect. No, I didn't. But
I can imagine that getting picked up on the mic. But yeah, right.